Chemistry Part 2, Functional Groups, Water, pH. Functional groups are, for us, probably the most important part of any molecule. The functional groups are like the hands and feet of a molecule. These are the places where molecules will interact. Vitally important for biological systems. We do need to know and be able to recognize the various different kinds of functional groups that we will find important for this semester, be able to recognize the chemical structure as well as the molecular formula and the names for all of the groups. There are illustrations in both the textbook and in these slides that will help you to learn the different functional groups. Depending on the different elements and atoms in a functional group will determine its chemical reactivity and how the functional group will interact with other parts of other molecules, or even other parts of the same molecule. Sometimes different functional groups will give a molecule a unique attribute. Amino groups that are found in molecules give a molecule what we call a more basic or alkaline characteristic. If it's a carboxyl group, we're going to find that that functional group gives a molecule an acidic quality. Most chemical reactions that occur are going to directly involve the functional groups of the different molecules. So functional groups are incredibly important in biological systems. This is an excellent study slide. When learning the different functional groups, the molecular formulas, in other words, the different atoms of the different elements that are used to construct the functional group, the chemical structure, and examples of where we can find these different kinds of functional groups. The next few slides will go through in more detail these different types of functional groups. Here we have the hydroxyl functional group. It's simply an oxygen and a hydrogen. This oxygen and hydrogen can be attached through the oxygen by one single covalent bond to whatever else the molecular structure could be. Whenever we find a hydroxyl group as part of a molecule, it tends to give that molecule the attributes of what we call an alcohol. So ethanol is a carbon molecule or organic molecule that has a hydroxyl group attached, and then we call it ethanol or ethyl alcohol. This illustrates another functional group called a carbonyl group. A carbonyl group is simply a carbon to which an oxygen is attached by a double bond. So carbon double bonded to an oxygen, that's the carbonyl group. Now, if we happen to find this carbonyl group at the end of a molecule, or what we call a terminal carbonyl, then we're going to more specifically say that that carbonyl group gives that molecule the attributes of an aldehyde. So aldehydes have terminal carbonyl groups, as illustrated in this drawing. If instead we have a carbonyl group that's within the carbon chain, or between the two ends of the molecule, or what we say an internal carbonyl, then that molecule now has the attributes of what we call a ketone. Fingernail polish remover, which is acetone, is a more specific example of a ketone, where we're going to find, if we look at the molecular formula and the chemical structure of acetone, there's an internal carbonyl group. This is an example of a third functional group, the carboxyl group. The carboxyl group is the combination of one carbonyl, and we use the carb part of that word as part of the word carboxyl, and one hydroxyl group. And the oxyl from hydroxyl is used for the rest of the word. So carboxyl is the combination of these two small functional groups. Carboxyl, carbonyl plus hydroxyl gives you this new functional group that has some new attributes. The carboxyl functional group can serve as a hydrogen ion donor, which is a type of definition for an acid. The hydrogen that's part of this functional group in certain conditions can be transferred to a different molecule. Whenever we see this carboxyl functional group on an organic molecule, we automatically assign an acid property to that organic molecule, or we might generally describe it as an organic acid. Here we have an amino functional group. An amino functional group is composed of a nitrogen atom and two hydrogen atoms. Whenever we find that an amino group is part of an organic molecule, this amino group can serve as a hydrogen ion acceptor, which is a definition of an alkaline or basic material or chemical. So the amino group, again, gives a unique property to whatever molecule it's attached. Of all the functional groups, the phosphate group, I think, is maybe the most important. Attaching a phosphate group onto an organic molecule dramatically alters the energy state of that molecule. And the more phosphate groups we pile onto a molecule, the larger or greater the energy potential of that molecule becomes. So that if we have a molecule like adenosine triphosphate with 3 phosphate groups attached to that organic molecule, we wind up with an incredible rich resource of potential free energy to perform work inside of a cell. Attaching a phosphate group onto a molecule, I often describe it as attaching a flare or a sparkler or a big red flag onto a molecule. Whenever we've added a phosphate group, we call that phosphorylation of a molecule. We dramatically alter that molecule and make it much more interactive with the rest of the mechanics or metabolism of the cell. If we've removed a phosphate group or dephosphorylate a molecule, that too changes its energy state and changes how it will interact with other molecules inside of a cell. Now, a free phosphate ion or free phosphate functional group floating around all by itself is simply illustrated with a capital P and a lowercase I. It could be used for phosphorylation of molecules. It can be used for all kinds of things in kind of a cell. So phosphate groups are incredibly important functional groups. Here we have the last of the functional groups that we need to know about, and that's the sulfhydryl group. A sulfhydryl group is simply a sulfur in a hydrogen atom that can be attached to a wide variety of molecules. Adding a sulfhydryl group to a molecule gives that molecule an attribute that we call a thiol. And thiol groups are very important in biological systems. If you've ever smelled rotten eggs or the smell from a skunk, those are examples of thiols in natural systems. Going to be helpful for all kinds of things, even those stinky smells. Now, in Chemistry Part 1, we described some of the polar nature of single molecules of water and the formation of hydrogen bonds. Well, the formation of hydrogen bonds that allow water molecules to hold together, or hydrogen bonds that allow different molecules to interact, are of course very important. But what about some of the unique properties of water, and why water is so vitally important in biological systems? Well, the next few slides will walk us through some of those important properties. This slide just reminds us of the polar nature of a molecule of water. And it's this different charge distribution of positive and negative charges. Whether they're full positive or full negative on molecules will depend on the molecule. But of course with water, we have two partial positive charges, one on each hydrogen, and two partial negative charges on the oxygen atom. Why does the oxygen have two partial negative? It's because the one electron from the hydrogen atom on the left spends part of its time circling the oxygen, in fact more of its time circling the oxygen than its hydrogen nucleus, and then the hydrogen on the right has its own electron which spends again more of its time around the oxygen, and that's where we get those two partial negative charges from the two different electrons from the two separate hydrogens. This slide summarizes some of the properties of water. Because of hydrogen bonds, ice, in other words solid water, is less dense than liquid water. Ice floats, a very important characteristic for organisms to evolve and to grow and live on Earth. Water has high surface tension. Those little bugs that scoot across the surface of a pond of water are able to do that because of the high surface tension that allows them to essentially walk on water. It has a low viscosity. It flows easily from one place to another. At typical environmental temperatures, especially for certain organisms, the liquid water has different characteristics in terms of light transmission and cohesive properties than, let's say, solid water or water in the form of a gas. And we find that water, at least in biological systems, is a universal solvent, used in all kinds of chemical reactions. Additional properties of water include high latent heat of fusion. In other words, that water molecule and that liquid water can absorb an incredible amount of caloric heat energy before changing temperature. High heat of evaporation, which is why when water or sweat evaporates from our skin, it actually cools us off because it takes some of that heat energy with it. And that high specific heat capacity, the reason that we find temperatures along coastlines more moderate than temperatures in the desert is because of those huge bodies of water that are able to absorb the heat energy slowly during the day and then slowly release that heat energy at night along coastlines to keep the temperatures moderate, in comparison to the extreme changes in temperature in the deserts where there is no water to help moderate environmental temperatures. pH is calculated or determined by measuring the concentration of hydrogen ions and the concentration of hydroxyl ions. Now, most of the time for biologists and biological systems, we can get away with just looking at the amount of or concentration of hydrogen ions, though chemists have very elegant equations that they use to really calculate pH, and they look at hydrogen ion concentration and hydroxyl ion concentration. I found that over the years, asking chemists is this little simple equation on this slide, where we have the lowercase p, uppercase h, which is actually a mathematician's abbreviation for negative log base 10 of the hydrogen ion concentration in moles per liter. Is that a good enough equation for biologists to understand what pH means? And every chemist I've ever talked to has said, for biology students, this is just fine. We're not going to calculate pH in this class. You just need to understand what the pH means. If we have a very small number when we perform this calculation, then we have a very acidic environment or solution. We have a lot of hydrogen ions. If when we perform this calculation we wind up with a large number, something greater than 7, then we wind up with an alkaline or basic solution or environment. When we do the calculations, we're going to find that we have a pH scale of numbers that can be calculated anywhere from 1 to 14. And depending on where the number is located on the scale will determine or tell us how many hydrogen ions do we have. When we calculate the concentration of hydrogen ions, and also possibly hydroxyl ions if we're using the more elegant equation that a chemist would use, and we wind up with an equal number of hydroxide and hydrogen ions. Well, we find that that equal number of hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions gives us a neutral pH. And when we calculate that number, we're going to get a number of 7. If we have more hydrogen ions than we have hydroxyl ions, then we're going to wind up with a number smaller than 7, and we have an acidic or acid environment or solution. If we perform the calculation and we have very few hydrogen ions, we wind up with a basic or alkaline solution or material, and we have a number greater than 7. pH scale is represented on this image. It's often a nice sort of visual image to show students what the scale looks like and representative types of materials that we can use in our daily lives or that we can find in living systems that also reflect the different types of pH. With neutral pH at 7, which is typically where we find our, let's say, human body pH in our bloodstream, which is very close to 7. Acid or acidic environments or acidic materials like lemon juice, battery acid, which have pH on the scale of 0 to 6.9, and alkaline or basic materials like ammonia or bleach, which have a pH of 7.1 to 14.